All right. Welcome back to Books, Barbecue, and Black History. Thank you all so much for your patience. I wanted to make sure that this was a good episode, so just had to go back and re record it. So, today, let me introduce myself again. So, my name is Toya. I am a North Carolina based social scientist, educator, and organizer with an abolitionist praxis. And today this episode is actually going to be about gender. So before I kind of get into anything, I want to go ahead and give a trigger warning that this episode is going to contain references to or discussions about of transphobia, homophobia, misogyny, misogynoir, mentions of sexual assault, child abuse, and other instances of patriarchal violence and abuse. So please be sure to take care of your mental health. But those will be things that will be discussed at some point through this episode. So, this is an episode about gender. And what we'll be talking about specifically is what gender actually is. We will be talking a little bit about the difference between patriarchies and matriarchies. We'll talk about feminism. We'll talk about how patriarchy is connected to white supremacy. And of course, wrap all of that up with why Black people need to know about this and why they should care about this. But before I actually do anything, of course, I have to start with my excerpt of the day. So I'm going to read this excerpt of the day, and then we'll come back around to that at the end of the episode, and I will explain. I will give you the name of the book, and I will tell you why I have chosen this particular book for this particular episode. So here goes. How often did you end up in places like Bridewell? I lost count, child. And the thing is, it only takes one time to realize there's nothing wrong with you. You didn't cause any pain to some other person to end up there. Some cop was having a daydream where you made a pass at him and got mad when he woke up and you weren't there. So he decided to take it out on you and put you in a padded room. So what I did was learn the things you have to say to get yourself out of there and to stay safe. A lot of the girls before Bellevue even happened to me would sit and we would talk together in groups about psychiatrists or doctors or nurses and go down the line and tell each other what this doctor or that nurse needed to hear so we could get ourselves out of that situation. Maybe you were lucky and your doctor had one half of 1/7 of a conscience. So you play off that. Living with these feelings inside of me is so hard to deal with, whether or not it was really hard for you. Once you told the people there, you'd get a sigh of sympathy. Oh, you poor dear. You learned to do and say what you needed to say to keep yourself safe and get out of that situation. So by say the fifth time, you're out of there in no time. You learn to say what they want to hear because no matter how they try to change you, they can't kill who you truly are deep inside. Was there ever a time when you thought maybe there's a chance the police could be reformed? As a Black person, as soon as I got arrested, it changed my point of view as to what the justice system was. I saw when I went to jail for the first time that it isn't fair. It isn't just. The white boy that was with me went home while I went to a cell. The system was never set up to be fair, and what prisons were made to do, they're doing. The people who make 99% of the laws, they set it up precisely so the laws protect them and their greedy asses from the rest of us. The laws are almost never set up to protect us, and in the few cases that they are, they break them. It's that simple. So we will come back to that, a little bit later. But I really want to start this conversation talking about what gender actually, usually when I'm talking about this, I start with what gender isn't, and then I go into what gender actually is. So what gender isn't is sex. So when we are talking about sex, sex refers to the physical or physiological differences between males and females. Most cultures only classify two categories. That means binary. That's male and female. But we do have babies that are born intersex, and that's just a broad term in the medical profession to classify individuals with a mix of male and female biological characteristics. So when we are talking about sex, those physiological differences are going to be related to your what is it, your primary secondary reproductive characteristics. So that would be body hair, that would be having a deep voice, that would be your genitals, that would be your breast. It would be anything that is kind of related to that. And the most important thing to kind of understand about sex is that when you are talking about sex, you are not talking about gender. So once you start getting into conversations about the body to make that as the definition of gender, you're already having an incorrect conversation. So the first part of understanding gender is understanding that sex and gender are not the same thing. When you are talking about body parts, you are generally talking about sex. Those, again, those physiological differences. So if we're talking about how that is not gender, so I know the question becomes like, well, what is gender? So gender refers to the behaviors, personal traits, and social positions that society attributes to being a man or a woman, or whatever those categories are within those societies. And in that definition, I would, like to point out that like none of that had anything to do with body parts. So again, gender refers to behaviors, personal traits, and social positions that society attributes to whatever the gender categories are within your society. And so in this society, in American society, the mainstream idea about gender is focused on the gender binary, just saying that there are only two genders, men and women, and we'll, build that out. So, really important to understand, the body does not define gender, because gender and sex are not the same thing. So, this is the kind of thing where, or kind of conversation where, if you don't have like that baseline understanding of like what the words actually mean, then you're not going to have a productive conversation in what you're talking about. So conceptually, gender and sex are not the same thing. I generally am doing research or like teaching about gender, and I teach about gender because gender is a social construction. And we'll talk about that in a moment and about what it means to be socially constructed. But when we talk about gender, we also have need to have a conversation about how people express gender. And so when we're talking about masculinity and femininity, masculinity just refers to qualities, characteristics, or roles conventionally associated with men. Femininity characterizes the traits, roles, and behaviors typically associated with women in a given society. So I just want to say that like this is talking about, these are associated with particular gender identities, but they do not belong to anybody. So masculine traits, sometimes people that are, I'm sorry, traits that are considered masculine or associated with masculinity might be suppressing, certain sorts of emotions, assertiveness, aggressiveness. Those things are generally considered masculine, whereas with femininity, the idea of being nurturing and empathetic and non-aggressive and submissive and sensitive, like those are the things that are associated with femininity. But men can be empathetic and nurturing and sensitive, just as women can suppress their emotions, be assertive, be aggressive. So all these things that people are saying like, oh, you got to be masculine, you got to be feminine, these are human traits. They're literally just human traits, but they tend to like be associated with particular genders. But like anybody can be like any of these different things. So masculinity does not belong to men, and femininity does not belong to women. And when people push those as like they have to inherently belong to those particular categories, I really hate to tell you, but that is also a form of white supremacy. But we'll get into that a little bit later. The next thing I want to talk about is, now that we know that there's a difference between gender and sex, gender is a social construction. I would argue that sex is also a social construction, but I won't, get into that per se. But gender is a social construction in the sense of, it was created socially by people, and so people create the meaning for it. And because people are creating the meaning for it, it means that it can look different across time, it can look different across locations, it can look different across like different social groups, different cultures. So gender is something that is very much taught to us. And I'm going to give you a couple examples of how gender is something that is socially constructed. So I'm gonna give two examples. So the first one I want to talk about are gender reveals. These are actually my favorite things to talk about to make this point. So I want you to think about how long you have known gender reveals to be around. I'll give you a second to think about it. And we'll come back to that. I will say. So I want you to think about gender reveals and what happens with, gender reveals. So at a gender reveal, there's usually the colors pink and blue. It will say it's a cake. Someone cuts open a cake, people assume that the child is a girl. If it is a girl, she's going to like dolls. She's going to be, emotional. She's going to be girly, whatever that means. She's going to, want, particular types of toys. She's going to like to dress up. She's going to like makeup. Like these very quote unquote feminine things are being associated with her. And we're assuming, it's a her. And when we are doing these gender reveals, I'm sorry. So you cut the cake open, it's pink. Say we do this again, we cut the cake open, it's blue. Assumption is, blue is a boy. He is going to be aggressive. We're going to have to, make sure he isn't, running around doing too much. He's going to be more assertive. He's going to want to get dirty, those sorts of things. And the question I always love to ask people, when they're talking about like gender reveals and having this sort of conversation is like, what do you actually know about that child, at a gender reveal? Because even, the idea of associating pink with a girl is the assumption that girls like pink. And that's just an assumption. So you don't really know anything about the child. And actually, I take that back, we do know something. Generally, we know the sex of the child, and because a lot of people associate sex and gender, as the same thing, you're really not revealing gender. I actually call them genital reveals, because you're not really revealing the gender of the child, because you can't reveal the gender of a child because that's their, personal identity, until the child like lets you know who they are. So we can assume who children are, but we really can't make that decision for them. And what's also interesting about, gender reveals and this conversation about socialization is, I want you to think about, have you ever seen people get upset about the revealing of the gender of their child, like the being upset about the gender the child is revealed as? And I find that interesting because you don't know that person. So, being upset about the gender of your child also is an indication that we have expectations that are associated with gender even before that child, enters into the world. We already are placing expectations on who we assume that child is going to be, because, again, if you don't know that child and their gender is revealed to you, like what is like, and I won't call it a reveal, but like someone tells you what you assume the gender to be, like what do you really know about them? What is to be disappointed, unless you already have an expectation of who you think that child is going to be. And so that is a part of kind of that social creation of this identity. So again, before we even have the children in the world, already, pink is a little girl, she's going to be this, she's going to be that. Blue, a little boy, he's going to be this, he's going to be that. But we don't really know any of this until we meet the child. And now I'm going to back it back up to talk about like the history of gender reveals. And the first gender reveal was actually in 2008. I am older than a gender reveal. If you were born before 2008, you are also older than gender reveals, or at least the iteration of how they are presented today. So, Jenna Karvunitis is credited as the inventor of gender reveals. In 2008, Jenna shared a blog called High Gloss and Sauce, talking about how she wanted to share the excitement of her pregnancy with family and friends. So she had a cake with pink icing inside, and that was the first, I would say, like iteration of a gender reveal. And what's really interesting about that is that Jenna is actually, I would say upset, but Jenna is actually not happy about the way that blog post that she had took off into the gender reveals that we actually see today, because she felt like, kind of like I just said before, that it started making, people place expectations on children before they even get there, just based off of, kind of these arbitrary things. And what's even more interesting about it, not just that Jenna regrets that she kind of made this popular, but also, or just created as like a thing, but also that the child that she did this for, that she revealed as a little girl, actually gets older, gets the language to kind of understand themselves. And child is non-binary. So the very first gender reveal that happened, the parent misgendered their child, and they regret that they actually did it, which again I find to be, just interesting. And another part about the socialization part, because part of socialization is like teaching people social identities and the social order of society. So social identities in our society are, with gender, the gender binary would be men and women, boys and girls. And that matches up to, again, the social order of our society, because the expectation is that those are the only identities within our society. So I also want you to think about think about, have you ever seen a gender reveal where a child is revealed to be a gender other than a girl or a boy? And I would say that's also a part of that social construction, because what I can tell you and what you're going to find as we go through this episode is that there are absolutely more genders than just girls and boys, men and women. And so by not including that in this particular like social gender reveal would be like a social part of like a social script, by not including any other identities in that, you reaffirm the gender binary. So gender reveals again aren't really gender reveals because you can't really reveal them, but they are a part of the socialization process and like constructing gender for us within our society. So it just adds to that creation of, oh well, only, men and women and girls and boys exist. Here's another, ritual we can do to kind of make that idea more salient. So that is the first example of gender being socially constructed. And the thing about like social constructions and socialization is a lot of this is also going to happen with kids, because developmentally, if you know anything about like child development, there are certain things you have to teach kids when they are really, really young, or it becomes like very, very difficult to get them to retain that information when they get older. So a lot of socialization actually happens as children, and a lot of times we don't even recognize that it's happening. So another really great example of gender socialization is, I want to talk about this idea of women being primary caregivers for children because of the idea that women are more nurturing than men. So I'm gonna start there, and then I'm gonna give you a little bit of like child psychology and social science to kind of unpack that. So the idea is that women are to be the primary caregivers over men because they are just naturally more nurturing. So let's talk a little bit about socialization, gender, and child development. So I'm not going to get too deep into this because, this isn't that type of podcast, but there's a guy by the name of George Herbert Mead, and he is white, so I ain't really trying to give him too much credit, but this little stages of self that he has are very relevant. So in the stages of self, this is really just talking about how children don't have an identity, and this changes as they grow, as they do like a lot of like socio-cultural, emotional like learning, with seeing the people around them. So like young babies, like I would say up to two, about mimicking, the people around them. That is like developmentally like how they're learning to communicate, like mimicking the people that are around them. But I want to talk about another stage. So that stage I just mentioned is called the preparatory stage. This one we're about to talk about is called the play stage under Mead's stages of self. So in the play stage, this is about from age 2 to 6 for kids. Children pretend, and if you have ever played with a child or try to play a game with a child from the age of 2 to 6, they got a lot of rules that you already know they're not really into, rules. They're going to do whatever they want to do. So the best games to play with them are the games of imagination. So one of those games of imagination that a lot of children end up playing, because this is also about emulating what they see around them so that they can learn, have their own identity for themselves. So they have to learn that from the people around them. And so when they play house, generally they're emulating what they have seen around them. So the game of house is, children will essentially pretend to be mommy or daddy, and how they behave is going to depend on, their observations. So when that game of house is happening, generally the assumed girl child is going to be the one who is expected to play mom. And if she's playing mom, the toys she might have might be brooms and kitchen toys and doll babies. And that would be like her tools, I guess, to play that game. Where we have the assumed boy child, he may be, he would be expected to be the dad in that game. And, the toys he might get are like toolkits and, cars and, just various things related to like generally some sort of work or like some sort of like physical labor, or grill set, those sorts of things. And like whenever I start naming those things, I hope it gets the ball rolling about like, well, we're giving, these toys to these particular kids. But remember, I said that this is really a conversation about socialization and teaching kids about gender. So those same kids that are playing this game of house, if that little boy decides that, what, I actually want to be mommy in this game of house, and I want to, play with the baby dolls, I want to, play with the kitchen set. And while there are, those of us that don't see an issue with that, there are going to be a lot of people that are not okay with that little boy wanting to play with that baby doll and get discouraged from like playing with that and playing with the kitchen toys and those sort of things. And that is gender socialization. That is literally gender socialization, because you are literally affirming or negating certain behaviors that children are doing because you want them to behave a certain way according to the gender and the gender roles you assume that they are supposed to engage in. So a little boy isn't supposed to play with dolls because that's a girl thing. That's a girl thing. But when you're playing that game of house and you're playing with the dolls, what you're also doing in that game is you are also reiterating gender roles. So if we have little girls being given toys of kitchen sets, of cleaning sets, of doll babies, and being encouraged to use those, and then at the same time telling little boys like, oh no, that's not yours, you don't need to do that, that is girl stuff. Then guess what happens as they grow up? As they grow up, and the little girls have had this time to basically practice. You're practicing for like the roles that people kind of expect you to be in as an adult. And so now we have you know these little girls who have had years of being kind of trained in domestic work, because that's what that is. Domestic work is like anything like being done around the house. So we have them being trained in domestic work for years, and boys not necessarily having that same sort of socialization or being encouraged to do those same sorts of things. And what happens, and we see this happening like statistically, is that the idea is now that, oh well, women are just more nurturing, that's why they're taking care of the kids. But as a social scientist, what I would say is that if you had years of practice doing something, you would probably be good at it too. And so like it's not that women are more nurturing, it's that we are literally socialized from children to engage in like certain behaviors. And so if you were taught from a certain age that this is how you take care of a house, this is how you cook, you should be interested in this, and then discourage another group from doing that, then that's going to show up in adulthood. And so the idea that women are more nurturing than men is actually it is a myth. It is not true. It is a behavior that is socially learned. Like nurturing is something that anybody can be. Like that is literally just a human trait. And a lot of this has to do again with how we are socialized, as children, of what we encourage and discourage, children from doing. Because one of the things that your family is actually responsible for is like teaching you about gender. And it's not always this explicit saying like girls do this or boys do this. It's in watching what people do. Like around the holidays, what do you see the different genders of your family doing? Do you see the women doing all the cooking? Do you see the men just sitting around doing stuff? Do you see them participating in the cooking? Who do you see like raising kids? Who do you see, doing these sorts of things? That is how you learn about gender. And so when we are talking about gender as a social construction, again, it's really important to understand that like this is not a biological identity. These are things we actually learn as we are growing. And like, yeah, I would just say like growing, we're always being socialized, but these are things like gender is something we actually learn. And there's actually not to get too deep into it, but there are actually theorists out there who say that like actually gender is a performance. So you are performing your gender for other people. But yeah, so that is essentially kind of the baseline of understanding, like when we're talking about gender, is that gender is a social construction. So whenever you talk about gender and biology and all of that, I really hate to tell you that you're wrong. Well, actually I don't, but you are wrong in your conversation, because gender and sex are conceptually different things. And as someone who like teaches about it and researches it and lives it, in my experience, it's really important to differentiate those, because the conflation of gender and sex also is used to engage in violence against people. But we'll talk about that later. Also want to define sexuality. Sexuality is describing an individual's pattern of attraction. It can be emotional, romantic, or sexual, or even a combination of these, or just none. You can not being attracted to anyone is also asexuality. Sexuality is also a social construction, in the sense of there are many different sexualities, and sexuality is like actually innate to people. And again, it's not necessarily sexual. Like, that's the part I feel like people miss sometimes, because like even when you're thinking about like a sexual orientation, like I think about like having, a first crush, and being very very young and having a crush. And for a lot of people, I can speak for myself, but I was like 6 or 7, like very young, and like I don't know why I like the person that I like. I just know I like that person. And to me, that is what it means to be innate, is that this is just something that you are, and that's just what it is. So like, sexuality is something that, like, as people change throughout their life, like they might find better ways to describe themselves. They might learn things about themselves. And so, sexuality just exists on a spectrum. It is not, something that may be static for people. And I feel like, that's one thing I would say is really hard with people with social science. Is like understanding the world is like not just black and white. I would actually say it's a spectrum of gray. So it's like all of these different things at once. It's not just, one or the other, which is what, living in a binary society tells you have to be. You have to be this or you are this. Like, there is no like in between. And that's not really how, the world works. So that's a little bit about what gender is and what it isn't. I want to talk a little bit now about patriarchies and matriarchies. So I'm going to start off talking about patriarchies, and then we'll get into matriarchies a little. So patriarchy, there is literally, in the same way that you cannot talk about race without talking about white supremacy, there is no conversation to be had about gender without talking about patriarchy. So, patriarchy is a social system that is structured around men. Generally, they hold power over women in political and social spaces. I like to start with the definition of patriarchy, but I actually believe that the concept of cis heteropatriarchy, which I learned from, just reading lots of Black LGBTQIA authors, and just being in community, just learning all of this. But cis heteropatriarchy is actually what I would consider a better description of the social hierarchy related to gender. And so cis heteropatriarchy is a system of power and control that positions cisgender heterosexual white men as superior and normative in their expression of gender and sexuality. And I specifically like this definition of kind of describing the social structure instead of just patriarchy, because it also includes the understanding that there are different identities that people hold at different times, and they create unique experiences, under patriarchy. So, and it also it introduces the idea that patriarchy isn't just about men, because I think if you just focus on men, you miss a lot of the other violence that ends up happening out there. So, with cisgender people, and the violence that they can, commit against, transgender people, and, heterosexual people, and the violence they can commit against really anybody that isn't heterosexual, then those become a part of the conversation when you name this as cis heteropatriarchy. Also, putting race in there, because race also matters, because, white men have the most amount of power within that system, but it doesn't mean that men of other races don't also, have that power as well, which we'll talk about, in a moment. In all known patriarchies, there are generally negative meanings attributed to women and their activities. These symbols and myths may be different in different cultures, but within each culture, they attribute negative meanings to women or the feminine. Shulamith Firestone discusses how human reproduction, which happens in mages, which stands for marginalized genders, bodies, is legally appropriated and controlled by men, and I'm be specific, cishet men, and is used to benefit cishet men, or to keep marginalized genders at the mercy of men. So these are just talking about kind of some of the things that you're going to see in a cis heteropatriarchal society, and I'm gonna build that out more, because even though this is about like the United States, this is, talking about the society that, I'm living in, patriarchy extends far past the borders of, the United States. It is actually one of the oldest forms of oppression. So this is not even specific to this particular society. It's not specific to being colonized, because this existed even before the United States. But patriarchal society generally protect the authority of men. There is compulsive masculinity. So boys are socialized to be ashamed of behaviors that are considered childish or feminine. There tends to be economic constraints and discrimination against people who are not men within the society. Women bear the burden of child rearing. There are usually denigrations of single families and negative attitudes towards divorce. There are, I don't like using the word traditional, because traditions are varied, between people, but there are very strict expectations of women's roles as like wife, being a wife or mother. And those are characteristics. It doesn't matter what patriarchal society that you were talking about. These are things that you're going to find in them, because this is a part of like, patriarchy. So a little bit about the consequences of patriarchal hierarchy, specifically like here in the US, because one thing I really like to point out when talking about things like this is like, this is not a conversation about individual behavior. This is a conversation about systems and like how they impact people. So some consequences, systemic consequences of patriarchal hierarchies in the US, first of all, are gender wage gaps. Any field that is dominated by women in society generally pays less money. And even outside of that, people who are not men are paid less money for same work, no matter if they are of the same, skill set. That is a consequence of the gender hierarchy and, devaluing, I don't say just devaluing, but putting people into hierarchies based on their gender. So people who are not at the top, who are not, the men, or I would say cishet white men, fall somewhere else within that hierarchy, but you're paid less simply because you fall lower in the hierarchy. That is a consequence of it. We also have a lot, the laws. So I'm gonna just read some of these laws when they were passed, and then we'll, talk a little more. But some of the laws that are related to these patriarchal hierarchies, because remember, who is making these laws? A lot of the times it's men. So let's talk about some of these laws that disenfranchise women systemically. 1769, American colonies based their laws on English common law. It said by marriage, the husband and wife are one person in the law. The very being and legal existence of the woman is suspended during marriage, or at least is incorporated into that of her husband, under whose wing and protection she performs everything. Layman's terms, what that means is that when you are married as a woman, you don't have no voice. Your husband is your voice. It's suspended, and I would argue in 1769 they won't let women vote anyway. But that is an example of a systemic way of disenfranchising, women. 1777, all states in the United States passed laws which take away women's rights to vote. 1920, the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is ratified. This is when white women get the right to vote. Got to be specific, because white women were the first ones to get the right to vote. So anytime they talk about the 19th Amendment, I really needed to be pointed out that white women got the right to vote before any other group of women. And that's important to talk about. 1963, we get the Equal Pay Act passed in Congress, promising equitable wages for the same work, regardless of race, color, religion, national origin, or sex of the worker. So before 1963, you could pay women less because they were women, and that was the law. 1972, the Supreme Court rules that the right to privacy encompasses an unmarried person's right to use contraceptives. What does that mean? That before 1972, that meant that unmarried people did not have like the right to privacy, to use contraceptives. So this again is that conversation about control of the body, right? 1974, housing discrimination on the basis of sex and credit against women are outlawed by Congress. So I know people may have been hearing people talk about like, grandmothers not being able to have credit and, all of that. And like, that's the law. That's the law. 1974. well, I would say this one specific, but it's around this time that we are now talking about like women getting like financial freedom. That's why, again, the conversations about like women being like too independent is so interesting, because I'm just like, do you know that like they couldn't have bank accounts? Like, it matters, to have financial independence, to take care of yourself. So those are just some examples, and like there were so many more that I could choose. Those were just ones I picked out for this episode, but like that's an indication that like it's not just that we're talking about like feelings of like, of being disenfranchised, like literally built into the law. The we talked about, amendment to even be included, in this conversation about being able to vote. So there is a long history of disenfranchising people based on their gender, within the society. We also, and now I'm kind of get into, the autonomy of body. So Roe v. Wade, I didn't mention that in the laws because I wanted to give that its own special section. But Roe v. Wade, which was really talking about abortion access, I would say, was passed in 1973, but it was overturned in, 2022. And I don't want to spend too much time specifically on Roe v. Wade. I'm just bringing that up as another law that kind of demonstrates this conversation about patriarchy and about power, to have impact on someone's life, because the people that overturned Roe v. Wade, a majority of those people like don't have the ability to have children. Like, and the people who that you know this particular law impacted the most were not a part of the conversation of, anything like happening. So the law was essentially overturned by men. Like, and I want to point out, trans men can also have children as well, but this was a law overturned specifically by cishet men. And that really has to be said, because that is a part of like that disenfranchising of people based on, their gender identity, because they're not even in the space to be able to, make these to even make these decisions. And so the Roe v. Wade being overturned is really a small part of a larger conversation about reproductive justice. So Sister Song defines reproductive justice as the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable environments. Indigenous women, women of color, trans people have always fought for reproductive justice, but and I'm sorry, I said women of color, let me be specific, Black women have always fought for reproductive justice, but the term was invented in 1994. And this was because, they recognized that the women's rights movement led by and representing middle class and wealthy white women could not defend the needs of Black women, or other marginalized gender, trans people, because that wasn't really, their focus. So there had to be a larger conversation about, the bodily autonomy, because, I haven't even gotten into the gender part, but like, even though I'm saying all this stuff, as a Black person, person marginalized by gender, then we already know that like there has never really been a time we've had like full autonomy over our bodies, as Black people. And then you add the gender on, on top of that. So that becomes, again, an important conversation again about like part of oppression is like not having full rights over like your own destiny, your own body, your own autonomy. That's something that's like really important. And this conversation again about, reproductive justice and having the right to make these choices for yourself. I would also point out that in North Carolina, because I'm always going to light North Carolina up when I see, certain things, but in North Carolina, recently 2026, because I don't know how long this is going to be up, but 2026, there were North Carolina Republicans trying to create a law that um, allows people to be murdered for using birth control or getting an abortion. And I'll read you what it says. House Bill 1232 states, any person who willfully seeks to destroy the life of another person by any means at any stage of life, or succeeds in doing so, shall be held accountable for attempted murder or for first degree murder, respectively. The bill goes on to say any person has the right to defend his or her own life or the life of another person, even by the use of deadly force if necessary. And advocates warned that the language written into that bill implied that anyone could use lethal force against someone seeking an abortion. or a physician involved in performing one, or if you're using birth control, or like it's just so vague. And the whole premise of it is that, this is to protect the life of the unborn child, and, murdering someone to protect a child is a interesting argument to make. And again, this was literally a few weeks ago in North Carolina, so that's why it's kind of, ridiculous. And I bring this up because another part of patriarchy that, has to be talked about, or, cis heteropatriarchy, is that abuse and violence are used to uphold that system, because patriarchy isn't a natural hierarchy, in the same way that I'm sorry, cis heteropatriarchy is not a natural hierarchy in the same way that white supremacy is not a natural hierarchy. So abuse and violence must be used to essentially maintain that hierarchy. So patriarchal and violence include sexual assault, intimate partner violence, criminalization of, pregnancy, child abuse. Oh, man, I'm sorry. It's like so much, but there are many different forms of patriarchal violence, and the whole purpose of patriarchal violence is to again uphold the gender hierarchy of cis heteropatriarchy, and also to exert control and power over these, groups of people. And so let's talk a little bit about this violence, and I'm specifically going to use sexual violence right now to make this point of like how normalized it is, and, just give you a little bit of statistics about it. So these are statistics about the perpetrators of sexual violence from RAIN, which stands for Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. When they're talking about the perpetrators of sexual violence, 60% of 60% of rapes are committed by someone known to the victim. Child abuse, people who abuse children sexually, 93% of those victims know their abusers. Perpetrators of custodial sex abuse, this is talking about people who are incarcerated. 60% of sexual violence against inmates is done by the institution staff. Demographics of who is committing this: 50% of these perpetrators are 30 or older. 57% of these perpetrators are white. When we are talking about people who are, and I'm sorry, 98% of perpetrators of these crimes will walk free. I'm going to revisit that statistic because I'm going to revisit that. When we're talking about the victims of sexual violence, nearly every minute someone in the US is sexually assaulted. Every 9 minutes that someone is a child. 69% of sexual assault victims are between the ages of 12 and 34. 1 in 6 women in the US has experienced, attempted, or completed rape in their lifetime. 1 out of every 10 rape victims are male. 82% of all the juvenile victims are female. 90% of adult rape victims are female. And a majority of these crimes are committed by men. And I think that people hear that and hear an accusation, and it is just stating a fact. Because a majority of this is what it means when we're talking about like gendered crimes. And I'm specifically talking about sexual violence and abuse, because these are crimes of power. These are crimes of power, because if you notice in those statistics, a lot of those victims are children. And given what's happening in the United States right now, these numbers really shouldn't even be surprising. And I also want to point out the demographics of like a majority of the people that commit these crimes are white. We're going to get into, black people in a moment, but a majority of people who commit the sexual violence crimes are white. And when you know the history of this society, then it will make sense why white people are going to be overrepresented in this. So, like, lots of conversation about black on black crime, all of that. I am telling you that a majority of these crimes tend to be committed by white people, and specifically, white men. And I'm saying this, and if you're paying attention to what's happening in the world right now, this is no surprise. We know it is. And if you were a black person, definitely not a surprise. We know what this is. So I'm pointing out again these statistics about, this violence that is present within this system, because there are actually societies that don't even have, domestic violence, that don't have, rape, don't have sexual assault. And, for these statistics to look the way that they do, the president is a pedophile. And the only way that he could get into a position like that is if that sort of sexual violence is, or sexual behavior is allowed within the society. And, one of the things that if you read a lot about patriarchy, you read, the people that are like studying it, like one of the things that is very much understood is that, again, sexual abuse is a tool to control people in patriarchal societies. So patriarchies generally have a lot of sexual assault happening in them. And it's because of that idea of part of the power within our society is like dominating other people. That's why the sexual abuse is essentially used. And I'll say this and I'll kind of move on from this particular part, but one of the things I remember reading, and I wish I remember who actually said this, but I remember reading somewhere someone saying that patriarchy unchecked leads to pedophilia. And I am of a firm belief that that is actually true, seeing what I've seen, knowing what I know, and just studying, the structure in itself. And so it is really important for me to kind of lift these things up because of the things that are happening, in the world right now. So this is a conversation again about, the violence that is used to uphold, the gender hierarchy. Because even though I'm talking about, the sexual violence, it's also a conversation about child abuse. And child abuse is also patriarchal violence. And I'll get into that in a later episode about my own research. But I want to talk about a particular type of child abuse. And I know, this is about gender, but I'm going to talk about children because children are also disenfranchised under patriarchy. So I want to concentrate on the people that are the most disenfranchised under this. And so I want to talk about another form of child abuse that most people probably don't even know is legal within our society, but that's child marriage. So child marriage is a harmful practice and is a very explicit manifestation of gender inequality. It disproportionately affects young girls, and child marriage occurs when one or both of the parties of marriage are below the age of 18. Child marriage is currently legal in 33 states. In the United States, 3 U.S. states do not require any minimum age for marriage. And overwhelmingly, these child marriages are young girls being married to adult men. Also really interesting when I was like learning about this is talking about child marriage and statutory rape. So statutory the so trying to get this out. So statutory rape occurs when one of the parties is below the age of consent, and it doesn't matter if it is forcible or not because a minor cannot legally provide consent. However, in most states, child marriage is considered a valid defense to statutory rape, meaning that if a child is married, that it is no longer considered statutory rape. And the fact that that is a thing within our society, again, says something. Also very interesting about North Carolina. I'm gonna just read what I saw. And all these things I'm saying, I'm gonna make available to you when I share my syllabus, but I just have to say these things. In 2020, the International Center for Research on Women released new data that estimated North Carolina to be among the top 5 U.S. states in terms of child marriages. The overwhelming majority of those marriages were between a minor and an adult. And alarmingly, 57% of these marriages involved 14 and 15-year-olds with age gaps large enough to constitute a felony offense under the state statutory rape laws. And again, like sometimes I'm not even looking for this stuff. It just shows up. So yeah, so for all these conversations about protecting children, there's a lot of loopholes for people to abuse children within, our society. And again, this is a conversation about who's making the laws, who is most represented in those positions of power. Um, Moving forward, there's also bigotry that results from cis heteropatriarchy. And bigotry is really just a commitment to a unfounded or yeah, I'll say unfounded belief or a belief that just isn't true. So misogyny is an example of bigotry. Misogyny, an extreme form of sexism that is defined as the hatred of women. Homophobia, fear, hatred, or discomfort with people who are lesbian, gay, or bisexual, biphobia, fear, hatred, discomfort of people who are bisexual, transphobia, fear, hatred, discomfort of people who are transgender, genderqueer, or don't follow traditional gender norms. And these ideas are important to talk about. And I'm not going to say like they're all from patriarchy, but patriarchy lifts up these ideas as it's normal to essentially have them, I would say. And these are important to talk about because these attitudes lead to people being denied jobs, housing, healthcare, just because they are of a particular gender identity, of a particular, sexual orientation. This leads to you can have negative attitudes, derogatory language, name calling, bullying, abuse, violence, genocide, which we'll talk about. Patriarchal societies in general posit lots of things connected to women or femininity as less valuable. But on the other hand, because I want to, leave it there, but on the other hand, we also have matriarchy. We have other social systems. And the assumption is often that a matriarchy would be a patriarchy with women. But let's talk about what that actually is in actuality. So, matriarchal society is a social system where women hold primary power, oftentimes leading their families, clans, tribes, or states. And in these societies, inheritance and lineage are typically traced through the female line, known as matrilineal order, which dictates property ownership and kinship. So, I'm going to read about a couple of matriarchal societies. I'm not going to spend too much time on these right now because we're going to build them out, as we continue talking. So a couple of matriarchal societies would be India's Khasi tribe. In Khasi culture, property and wealth are inherited through the female line, and women have a strong say in household and community decisions. Women are also free to choose their own partners, and divorce is not stigmatized. Ghana's Akan people. The Akan people of Ghana have a matriarchal society where, again, inheritance and succession are traced through the female line. They women hold a high status in this culture and often make important decisions regarding family and community affairs. Men still hold positions of power in government and religious institutions, but women have a strong presence in Akan society. What I'll say about matriarchies before I move on to the next point is that something I find really interesting about matriarchal societies and how they're different from patriarchal societies is that matriarchal societies are very community oriented. There is more sexual autonomy for people within that society who are not men. Children are taken care of as a community. I haven't seen like a lot of nuclear families in matriarchal societies. The gender roles are not necessarily placed in a hierarchy, I would say. So there's a lot more respect for the work that is done by the feminine, I guess, like characteristics and work and all of that. And like what I really love about matriarchal societies is that they center children. Patriarchal societies center men, matriarchal societies center children, not actually women. And I think that that's a really big difference in like how they actually function. And, we'll get into that a little bit more, but that to me is like one of the biggest differences between a matriarchal and patriarchal society. Also want to mention feminism. Feminism is a social, academic, and cultural movement aimed at interrogating and changing the economic, civil, and ideological disparities between men, women, and those who identify outside the gender binary. I'm not even going to take time to talk about white feminism because I'm not interested in that. I'm going to specifically focus on Black feminism. So, Black feminism has the same, vision of, looking at these disparities between people of different gender identities and like wanting equity for all of them. But there's also the addition of understanding that you have to talk about, race and classism and, ability. All of those things also matter. Your immigration status, all of those things also matter. I'm sorry, nationality specifically, when we're talking about a person, because white women problems are not necessarily, Black women problems. Because that conversation about like, having the right to vote, like white women went up for their right to vote, but didn't consider like, you know, Black women and, not really having any rights or being seen as a human. So Black feminism is really born out of that. And there are many different types of it's called Black feminisms, but there are many types of Black feminisms, but that's generally what they have in common is looking at more than just gender. We're looking at the intersections, different identities. There's also queer theory, and that can be summarized as exploring the oppressive power of dominant norms, particularly relating to sexuality. An idea that comes out of that would be heteronormativity. And heteronormativity denotes talking about a worldview that promotes heterosexuality as the normal or preferred sexual orientation. This is the idea that, homosexuality is a phase. Media representation of majority, heterosexual couples, the parental disapproval of LGBTQIA children, as if like heterosexual is the only thing that they could be. These are all a part of that idea of heteronormativity, when heterosexuality is just a type of sexuality, is not the only sexuality that people can be. Under Black feminism, and queer theory, I want to just note some Black marginalized genders who have influenced me. And this is a reminder to always, cite Black people, cite Black women. Kimberly Crenshaw and her idea of intersectionality is something that I learned and was really important to me. Intersectionality describes the bias and violence against Black women. It is a framework through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. This is related to Patricia Hill Collins' Matrix of Domination. Patricia Hill Collins is a Black sociologist, a Black feminist. She describes four interrelated domains that organize power relations in society. And I won't get too deep into that because Patricia be in her bag. So Patricia Hill Collins has a very robust explanation of, again, how these intersecting identities and structures create unique experiences for people. And that, again, is kind of take, I won't say a play, but like it's related to intersectionality. But Patricia Hill Collins' Matrix of Domination is more of a sociological framework, I should say. We also have the concepts of misogynoir and transmisogynoir, and this comes from Moya Bailey and Trudy. Misogynoir is a specific type of misogyny that has its roots in racism and the anti-Black racist misogyny that Black women specifically experience. Transmisogynoir is similar, but it highlights the intersection between transphobia, misogyny, and anti-Blackness. And this term was coined by the writer Trudy Misogynoir from Moya Bailey. Angela Davis, gotta always bring her up because she is literally my introduction to abolition. Our Prisons Obsolete is like one of like my favorite books. Beth Ritchie, I've said this before as well, but like Beth Ritchie informs most of the work that I do. I will talk about her in, my research when I do that episode. So, just lifting her up as well. But those are all Black mages who influenced me, and what they all did was they gave me language to describe my experience as a Black woman. And it's something that's so powerful about having the words to name the things that are happening to you, because now you can connect with other people who also have, that experience. So like all of those are people who, and there are many more, but these are just the ones that I could fit in this episode. So next thing I want to talk about is how patriarchy is connected to white supremacy, because yeah, patriarchy and white supremacy kind of work hand in hand. So cis hetero patriarchy is a part of white supremacy because just like white supremacy, or racial supremacy, it places people into a gender, sexuality, age hierarchy, and it uses violence to maintain it. The same way that, again, white supremacy places people into racial hierarchies and uses violence to maintain it. When we're talking about kind of the historical context for this, that's also important because when we're talking about patriarchy and gender, so first of all, enslaved people had no gender because they were considered property, chattel. They were treated like livestock, so they were bred like livestock. And I'm bringing that up as well because you are more likely to learn about cotton, rice, sugar plantations than breeding plantations. But there are books like The American Slave Coast, A History of the Slave Breeding Industry, that really explore this idea of how the breeding of human beings was integral to the formation of the United States. And that part of the conversation really gets left out because, again, it says a lot about the society that was willing to do that. And because these sexual assaults were happening to people who were not considered, human beings, there was no crime committed. Because if you are not a person, if you are just a thing, if you are just chattel, if you are property, you cannot be a victim. So we already have the structure set up for, we've already created a identity within our society where these people can never be victims. Black people can never be victims of violence because your body does not belong to you. And that's how it has always started. And again, so you add on top of that, now you add gender to it. And you have that, additional, hierarchy. And women, even when we're talking about, again, this historical context, women, or people who were not men, were not considered full people even in the Constitution when the country was created. Enslaved girls and women, like I said, they were literally bred like animals, implicitly noting that Black women and people in general could not be victims of assault, because again, you don't have rights to your own body. And I would also say that there's a reason why you aren't encouraged to read like autobiographies of people like Harriet Jacobs, which I'm going to talk about in the next episode. You're not reading, autobiographies about enslaved Black women, because if you read those biographies, you're going to find out exactly what type of people, the settlers were. And even outside of like the slavery aspect of it, there's also indigenous people who were here as well. So European colonists expected the indigenous people, to assimilate into their belief and value systems, which included their religious beliefs. And this was done through murder and forced assimilation. So gender roles have always varied amongst many cultures, but the settler colonial white supremacist US idea of gender is that of the English settlers who colonized this land. That is the norms of our society. So the gender binary is an artifact of colonialism, because how can there only be two genders when we like, and I'm gonna name them for you, but we can name pre-colonial gender identities. So specific, I'm gonna give you a couple, but so specifically here in the US, before the US was the US, we have two-spirit people. This is a term some indigenous North Americans have adopted to refer to people in their communities who are believed to embody both a male and female spirit. Two-spirit people are seen as being uniquely able to see, life from, what is it, male and female perspectives, and to bridge the differences between them. And we also have the Hijra. The Hijra are, the most common non-binary identity recognized in in India today. Hijras are found in Hindu religious texts and throughout South Asian history. Many Hijra are born with male sexual characteristics, though the Hijra community also includes intersex people. In pre-colonial times, we also have women in West Africa who were conspicuous in high places. They led armies, they played important consultative roles in politics. And what that meant is that being a woman was not rigid in Africa, was not necessarily rigid in many African pre-colonial societies. And I'm reading all these things to say is that people had gender identities and gender fluidity before colonialism. And if you've learned nothing about, your culture before it was colonized, then a lot of that stuff you're not going to necessarily have, access to. And so this is why I'm leading into this, why Black people really need to know about gender, patriarchy, and this connection to white supremacy. So the first one is that Black transgender people are experiencing a genocide, and Black LGBTQIA people are being targeted by white supremacists intentionally. And it is because part of whites being assimilated into white supremacy is being assimilated into homophobic beliefs, transphobic beliefs. And if the people in power understand that it is easier to strip people of their rights if you start with the people that people care the least about, that are the most vulnerable. And so transphobia, and I'm not specifically saying that Black people are more transphobic than anyone, but we are also impacted by white supremacy and those sorts of beliefs. But transphobia is the reason why a lot of Black folks don't care that there are bills denying health care, to trans people, stripping them of their ID, effectively giving them what we call a social death, where you can exist within society but not actually be able to participate in society. And all the things that they're doing to trans people is like that is Jim Crow. So you're Black and you're trans, and then we ain't even talk about adding in, additional identities. So it means that you are even more at risk, for this violence within society. And bigotry against Black trans people and other members of the Black LGBTQIA community actually strengthens fascism. And I have to say this because literally did a workshop about this today. And in the fight against fascism, specifically anti-Black fascism, Black LGBTQIA people and the way that they have organized is literally a part of how we are here today. And I have to say this because it is Pride Month, not just because of that, but because it is true. Black people are a lot of things. There is no gay agenda. Black people are Black and gay. They're Black and it is not you're just Black. We are many different things. And, it's really important for me to like say and lift these things up because of the things that I have seen, the things that I have experienced. And I'm sorry, I'm getting them a little soapbox right now. Let me move on. Cis heteropatriarchy is also killing, not just specifically talking about like the genocide against Black trans people. It's literally killing and harming, the Black community overall. Black femicide is a problem. Black femicide is a problem. Femicide is defined as an intentional killing with gender related motivation. Is different from homicide when the motivation may not be gender related. Femicide is a global issue. It is absolutely also a racial issue. In many cases of femicides, the murders are actually done by intimate partner or a family member. It can be related to rape or sexual violence. It can be related to again inter partner abuse, that sort of thing. And it is again something that's very common. The femicide of Black women in the US is a major public health concern that has received minimal attention. Black women in the US, including Black trans women, are at an increased risk for murder, including but not limited to interpartner homicide and homicide by the police relative to their white counterparts. I really feel the need to talk about this. And actually my research will get more into it, but I really feel the need to like make space for this because, you know, the the murder of Black women is so normalized, and again that people don't even like really talk about it. And part of the reason of not talking about it is because then we have to have that conversation about is who is actually engaging in that behavior, which I'll get into in a moment. But when a majority of Black femicides are committed by someone that is within the family or someone that the person actually knows, then what that also says is that this is a problem like of what we call it a interracial crime, meaning that these are crimes committed by people within the community. So who is killing, these Black women? And the answer is overwhelmingly more often than not, it is Black men. And I think that that is a hard conversation to have, but it is a honest conversation to have. It has been an issue because people don't really want to talk about it. But part again of patriarchy is upholding patriarchy with violence. And that is something, that actually happens. Black people, even though a lot of people are trying to assimilate into, this cis heteropatriarchal version of gender, we were never really, included. And, you don't have to be a man to harm somebody in a cis heteropatriarchal structure. Cisgender people can still, I'm sorry, yeah, cis people can still harm, trans people. Heterosexual people can still harm all other people. There's violence against, LGBTQIA youth from adults. A lot of times that harm comes from their family and the church. Child abuse is also a part of this, and this is something I'll talk about in my research. And child abuse is also something I would say also kind of, I would say building that out is important because it also is around this idea of like women being nurturing. Also allows for ignoring that, Black mamas can abuse their kids too. And, the idea that women are naturally nurturing kind of negates that reality of like that actually happening. So, but I do want to, of course, also point out that regardless of all of that, Men benefit from patriarchy regardless of, their race. While men are still harmed under patriarchy in the same way that white supremacy harms white people, there is still a benefit that Black men specifically get from patriarchy. And so I actually want to read a little bit off of this Black male privilege checklist that who Jewel Woods. So this was written by a Black man. And this is really, and actually, I'm not even going to tell you. I'm going to just read you a little bit of what it says, and then I'm going to talk about it a little. So Jewel Woods made this Black male privileges checklist, it looks like in 2008. And here's a little context of like why it was created and background, and then I'll read you some of the things on the checklist. So inviting Black men and boys into a conversation about male privilege does not deny centuries of discrimination or the burden of racism that we continue to suffer from today. As long as a Black man can be tasered 9 times in 14 minutes, shot at 50 times in the morning of his wedding night, or receive less callbacks for a job than a white man with a felony record, we know that racist sexism that targets Black men is alive and kicking. Examining Black male privileges offers Black men and boys an opportunity to go beyond the old arguments of personal responsibility or blaming the man, to gain a deeper level of insight into how issues of class and race are influenced by gender. Gender is one of the most important tools in the production and reproduction of power because it relies on consent and not just coercion. The Black Male Privileges Checklist was born out of years of organizing men's groups and numerous, often heated conversations I had with men while utilizing Barry Deutsch, the Male Privilege Checklist. In my experience, most men will object to at least some of the items on the checklist. However, men of color, especially African American men, often had the sharpest criticisms of the male privilege checklist and the most problems related to the idea of male privilege. Invariably, the Black male privileges checklist will inspire some men to create their own list describing the list of privileges they believe Black women benefit from. What men need to understand is that paying attention to male privilege does not mean that women are without faults. Rather, it means that Black men cannot be blind to the facts that Black men earn more than Black women do. Black men continue to dominate most of the political, religious, and cultural institutions within the Black community, and Black men continue to dominate Black women in areas of physical and sexual abuse. So here are some of the things that are written on this Black male privileges checklist. When I read African American history textbooks, I will learn mainly about Black men. When I learn about the civil rights movement and the Black power movements, most of the leaders that I will learn about will be Black men. I can live my life without ever having read Black feminist authors or knowing about Black women's history or Black women's issues. I can be part of a Black liberation organization like the Black Panther Party, where an out rapist like Eldridge Cleaver can assume leadership position. My looks will not be the central standard by which my worth is valued by members of the opposite sex. In general, I prefer being involved with younger women socially and sexually. In general, the more sexual partners I have, the more stature I receive among my peers. I have the privilege of not having Black women dress up and play funny characters, often overweight, that are supposed to look like me for the entire nation to laugh. I can believe that the success of the Black family is dependent on returning men to their historical place within the family, rather than in promoting policies that strengthen Black women's independence or provide that social or that provide social benefits to Black children. I have the privilege of believing that a woman must submit to her man. I have the privilege of believing that feminism is anti-Black. Yeah, and I'll just stop there. But you kind of get the gist. And I this checklist is really interesting. And I really picked it because it was written by a Black man, because I think sometimes men need to hear stuff from men, to, even though, like, we be saying it, but I think that they need to hear it from men to like really understand. And like, one of the things that it said in here was about, like the Black history part, about how when you're learning Black history, part of patriarchy is like more people are going to talk about Black men when they start talking about civil rights movement than they are to talk about, Black women or Black mages in general. And to me, and so a couple of examples I have of that is I think about the North Carolina, I'm sorry, and I'll name it as they usually call it, is the North Carolina A&T sit-ins. Rarely are the Bennett Bells mentioned, and they're the only Black HBCU for Black women in North Carolina, and they were a very large part of, the Woolworth Counter, sit-ins. But most of the time people talk about, just the A&T 4. So part of them being left out is, again, that that conversation about like men's contributions kind of mattering more, within those movements. And I find that really interesting as someone who does a lot of organizing, because I've been organizing for years now. And one thing I will point out is that most of the time, and if you organize for real, then you already know this to be true, but most of the time, Black mages are on the front lines of organizing work. And a lot of times the Black men get lifted as the leaders, but a lot of that work that's done in the background generally is not done by Black cishet men. It just isn't, or at least that hasn't been my experience. That's not generally what I read about in historical, texts. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but that has been what I have seen. Also want to note, I remember when I lived in Greensboro, when they did a Black Women and Girls Matter event in Greensboro, I also noticed that like most of the people there were Black mages. And when I say mages, I mean marginalized gender. So anyone who isn't a cisgender heterosexual man. So like even in that space, I noticed, not showing up, for that. Also, just really interesting again about like who gets lifted up in those conversations about, you know, Black history. And on my page, like when I launched this page before the podcast was here for Black History Month, I did a Black History Month book list. And on that list, the one thing that I was like, I want everybody on this list to not be a cishet man. The only exception to that was, what was it? Was the We Charge Genocide petition. But all of the people that I put on that list of for the month of February of like Black history reading, all of those people were not men. And that was well, I won't say not men, but they were not cishet men. But it was really important for me to make that point of including, these groups of people, because a lot of times the people that's doing a lot of the work don't get, any recognition for the work that they're doing. And I just think it's really important to name, the people that are doing the work. Also, again, want to reiterating that even though Black men experience again racism, patriarchy allows for these things again, like the stories of Black men to be lifted up historically, as opposed to Black women or anyone that falls outside of the gender binary. Also, even conversations about like police brutality. Whenever I see people using the say her name hashtag, without understanding that the reason that that hashtag was created by, if I'm not mistaken, the African American Policy Forum, which is Kimberly Crenshaw's organization. But that hashtag was created because even in conversations about police brutality, people who are not Black men get left out. People treat police brutality as if it is something that only happens to Black men. And Black women and Black mages are also killed by the police. And that's where say her name comes from. So if you ever use say her name and it is not a Black, and it's not for like a Black mage, then you are using it incorrectly, and you are also contributing again to that erasure that the hashtag was essentially created for. And again, that is the result of patriarchy, which again is calling to the point about how you can be privileged in some ways and oppressed again in others. Really want to kind of wrap I guess that part up with like Black men still have the power to utilize patriarchal power even as they experience racism, the same way that I myself can utilize my class via my education, and my gender identity as a cisgender person to harm people more marginalized than me. So just because you are oppressed again in one way does not mean that you can't still harm other people. And again, reiterating that you do not need to be a man to utilize patriarchal violence. Cishet people do it by being transphobic and homophobic. Adults do it by the violence they use towards children. And in the same way, you don't need to be white to uphold white supremacy. You do not need to be a man to uphold cis heteropatriarchy. All you need to do is defend, justify, or participate in the harm that cis heteropatriarchy causes those that are marginalized in that system. We'll also note that religion does not negate patriarchal violence or bigotry. So your religious beliefs, whatever they are, does not negate whether they are homophobic or transphobic or biphobic or whatever they are, misogynistic. It does not change that. It just provides context, I would say, to like those beliefs. But like believe your religious beliefs are a choice. People's identities are who they are. So one is one that you're choosing, the other one is just inherently who someone is. Now, my favorite part is I want to talk about what I learned as a sociologist in my, I guess, learning about gender. Is I learned a lot about the sacredness of gender expansive people. I know that a lot of this episode has been about like violence and all of that, but I got to keep it real about the violence of patriarchy. But I also want to point out again that the sacredness of gender expansive people. So gender expansive people have been considered sacred in their cultural in their cultures for a very long time. The colonial values present and views about gender in the U.S. Society makes it hard, I guess, for us to kind of see that. But in many cultures, like I said, the Hijra, the Two Spirit people, these were groups of people that were considered like sacred within their culture. And it really makes a lot of sense because if you exist outside of the binary, you exist outside of the confines, of what people say like a human, actually has to be. So if you can exist outside of that, I, can totally understand the spiritual nature of that. So in pre and I'm concentrating on the black folks right now, but in pre-colonial Africa, there was also a lot of gender fluidity. And so due to the duality of, their existence, these qualities of gender fluid people meant that they were better suited to serve as messengers between the human and spirit world. So I'm going to share a few of these with you. So the Muami prophets of the Ela people in Zambia were men who dressed as women, went about traditional women's work, and slept with women without having sex with them. Among the Lubara people, transgender individuals often carried out communication with the spirit world. Due to the duality of their existence, again, their qualities meant they were better suited to serve as messengers between the human and spirit worlds. Let me see. Transgender women mediums are named okule, like women, and transgender men mediums were called agule, like men. The chibados of Angola were male diviners who channeled feminine spirits by acting like women. And the commonality between many of these examples, because these are only a few, but like I've read books where I have seen at least 60, 70 different gender identities just in pre-colonial Africa that exist, and women and men were nowhere in there, by the way. But the commonality between many of these examples is that they inhabited a spiritual role within their respective societies. They possess a dualistic gender identity, giving them unique power to communicate with the spiritual realm. And there's a very strong correlation between trans identity and being spiritually powerful in pre colonial African societies. Um, so to be black and exist outside of the colonial confines of who black people are supposed to be, that's what makes trans people and non-binary people and gender queer people so powerful, because not only are they black, but they also have, a gender identity that has historical connections to like very sacred, spirituality. And like, I'm not sure, like, and for me, to learn that just as a black person, it just makes me have like just so much more respect. Not that I didn't already have that, but just gives me like so much more respect for this part of, our community. And like, this is literally why the episode is called The Most Sacred Black Folks, because the most sacred black folks are the transgender people, the non-binary people, the gender fluid people, those people who exist outside of the binary and are black, because it's already great to be black. So now you're black and you're this. So I'm just like, hopefully the rest of, people will get to that one day. But like, you know, these are some of the most sacred black folks, in our community. And look how the world treats them. Look how the world treats them. These are often the people that are at the forefront of, many human rights, civil rights movements, and experience the most violence within the black community. And part of the reason why black trans people, gender queer, gender fluid people, are non-binary people are targeted so much is because their existence actually exposes the lie of cis heteropatriarchy, that there are only two genders, that women are supposed to submit, that men are supposed to lead. All these sorts of expectations of gender roles, they defy those. They defy them because they understand it's not real. It's made up. Like somebody is trying to tell you who you have to be. And they said, no, I'm going to be myself. So you can't say that only two genders exist when we see all these different expressions of gender outside of the binary. When you read about all these people that existed in a variety of different gender identities before the first Europeans landed over here and genocided the indigenous people, genocided, black people stole them. And so it's really important for me for people to understand, again, our stories did not start with slavery. And so if you understand our stories did not start with slavery, then if you don't know anything about who we were beforehand, then all you're getting is a secondhand account of who people have told you that you are, as a black person. So it's my little thing for that. So now I want to mention the book that I was reading an excerpt from. So the book that I read an excerpt from for this episode is Miss Major, Conversations with a Black Trans Revolutionary. I'm sorry, Miss Major Speaks, Conversations with a Black Trans Revolutionary, Toshio Marinek and Miss Major. So it was basically like a conversation. It's Pride Month. There's no way I couldn't center a black trans woman for this episode. That would be ridiculous, honestly. So Miss Major Griffin Gracie, rest in power, is a legendary transgender activist. Was known for many things in her community. She was known for getting black trans women off the street and housed when they faced poverty and violence, advocating for trans rights. She was known for demanding that LGBTQ people focus on protecting the most vulnerable among them. A veteran of the 1969 Stonewall Uprising in New York, she was known as a queer elder who did not want the past to be used as an excuse for inaction. The excerpt I read, Miss Major talked about having to lie to other people about how they felt about like themselves so that they could gain like a small amount of empathy, which I thought again was really interesting. And she pointed out how like even though we're saying what they want to hear, these people can try to change you, but they really can't kill your spirit, and that sounds very black to me. So I definitely resonate with that. She named the criminal justice system for what it was in a few in a few sentences. The criminal justice system functions the way that it's supposed to. Laws do not protect black people, and if they do, they change them. I don't even have to tell y'all. It don't even matter what point in time that you hear this episode, there's going to be something that happened, unless the United States doesn't exist anymore. There's going to be something that happened where it's the indication that there's a different justice system for black people. What I really got out of, this book, and learned from Miss Major in this interview is that, people who are the most marginalized can give you the best analysis of society. So I know, like, and I don't even say I know, but like I've already learned, like trans people be knowing, like they be knowing because they're existing within a society that in a variety of ways tries to show them that they shouldn't be here, even though their existence predates the society that they're living in. There's never been a point in time where trans people have not existed. We may have different names for different identities, but people have always existed outside of the binary. And part of what colonialism likes to do is it likes to alter the history. You can't tell like the true story. So we don't even know the names of the indigenous people, a lot of people, of like the land that you're actually on before it was called whatever state that you're in. So if you don't know even the names of those people, then you don't know nothing about their culture. You don't know nothing about their gender identities, their religious practices, or any of that. And but we'll start with what essentially white people have told us gender is, and what gender should look like, even though we're not necessarily a part of it. And I find black LGBTQIA people, and specifically trans people, to be the most honest versions of who black people are, because they're living their lives without allowing white supremacy to dictate who they have told black people are supposed to be. And I guess that's my next point, is like black trans and queer people embody the black liberatory spirit that so many black people claim to have. I think it says a lot that there are black folks in the black community that have more smoke for trans people than they have for white people, because where's that energy going? It's just very interesting. There is no gay agenda. There is no gay agenda in the black community. There is no gay agenda. You've just been successfully assimilated into white supremacy. Black people have existed outside of the colonial definitions of gender and sexuality before white people ever set foot in the motherland. So there is no gay agenda. Black people without a gender analysis, or who don't have the ability to engage how different identities intersect and create unique experiences, I would also say are very dangerous to Black liberation movements, because it will again kind of be that reproduction of white supremacy with a Black face, because I'm not interested in reproducing, white supremacist hierarchies without, examining the harm, that they've actually, caused. And I chose this particular book because in doing a lot of abolitionist work and organizing, and as a social scientist who studies, these sorts of things, I understand that the erasure of Black transgender people and Black LGBTQIA people in general from Black history is intentional, in the same way that erasure of Black history is intentional. A world that is safe for Black people to thrive must include the most vulnerable and marginalized. So again, you cannot be pro-Black if you are homophobic. You cannot be pro-Black if you are transphobic, because these are also people within our community. So the hatred of those people also is a hatred of Blackness. And I'll leave that there. The people who are within the margins of the margins within the Black community are oftentimes the ones holding up, leading these Black liberation movements. It's not the academics, it's not the celebrities, it's not the people that you see. It's oftentimes the people you don't ever hear about, like Miss Major. So the inspirational Black quote that I'm going to leave you with today comes from Pauli Murray, who I will talk about in the next episode, because Pauli Murray is actually Black North Carolina history as well. But the quote reads, "When my brothers try to draw a circle to exclude me, I shall draw a larger circle to include them. When they speak out for the privileges of a puny group, I shall shout for the rights of all mankind." And this is inspirational because one, Pauli Murray is a part of Black North Carolina history, but the things that I've learned and continue to learn about gender are precisely why I do not debate anybody's humanity or try to prove that, there are more than two genders, or, any of those sorts of things, because I already know that I'm not going to be a part of dehumanizing people. And I am in community with people of all different, backgrounds. And it is very important for me to always lift up and make space and advocate for people who are more, marginalized than me. Because at one point I was like, oh, I'm a Black cis woman. So, I'm the most marginalized. And one of my very, good queer homies let me know, like, actually, and, I went on a journey with that. And I had to really understand that, like, you have to check yourself, sometimes, and humble yourself and realize that, sometimes you are not the person that is the most vulnerable within the community. Also, brought this up because I actually think it's kind of wild for people to be more accepting of white people, people in the Black community specifically, to be more accepting of white people, of predators, of abusers, than Black trans people, than Black LGBTQIA people, because that's wild. Because those are also the people within the community that are also doing a lot of, like a lot of the work around police brutality that I see, around abolition that I do. It's a lot of queer people there. It's a lot of queer people there. And I don't see a lot of Black cis men there. And that's just me being real. And I've been doing this for a long time. And so for me, it says something about who our, who we decide to protect. And that to me is also, again, that indication of, like, patriarchy, and really needing to have that conversation about it. Black cishet men are not the most marginalized in the Black community in terms of gender. Are they marginalized? Absolutely. Absolutely. But the idea that they are the most marginalized, and that, other people have privileges, like, over that, is something that I think should be unpacked. Liberation really got to be for all people, or else we're going to again produce white supremacy with Black faces. So conversations around patriarchy, like, actually really must be had, because also, in doing a lot of reading, if you read a lot, if you read anything, I wouldn't say anything, but a lot of, you know writings by Black mages, so marginalized genders, are going to talk about patriarchy, are going to talk about the gender dynamics. And so I personally do not take a lot of people seriously if there is no understanding that gender matters or that patriarchy is real. That is not a debate I tend to have with people. But I do think it's an important conversation to have. But I do want to leave with, of course, the understanding that Black trans people, Black LGBTQIA people are some of the most sacred people in our communities. And the liberation of Black people is very contingent on that group of people, children, you know, some of the most vulnerable people under the system of patriarchy, people that are having babies. These are the people that I would say should be centered, when we're talking about, Black liberation, because we'll just continue again reproducing, the same sorts of, systems that we are trying to escape from. So again, these it seems like we're getting longer, but this one was the episode for me that I had to put some time and effort into. So I am again looking forward to continuing to learn with you, and like, comment, subscribe.